The stagecoach rattled into Guthrie, Oklahoma territory on a blistering August afternoon in 1893, and inside sat Rebecca Hughes with her hands pressed protectively against the worn leather trunk that contained her most precious possessions. 47 books she had collected since childhood, each one a doorway to worlds far beyond the cramped Boston tenement where she had grown up. Rebecca pressed her face to the dusty window, watching the main street roll past with its false-fronted buildings and wooden sidewalks. Her heart hammered beneath her modest gray traveling dress, uncertainty coiling through her chest like smoke. She had answered an advertisement in the newspaper 3 months ago, exchanging letters with a rancher named Xavier Oakley, who needed a wife and had promised her honesty, hard work, and respect. He had written that he owned a cattle ranch 10 miles outside of town, that he was 28 years old, and that he had been too busy building his life to court properly. She had written back that she was 24, educated by the local parish priest who had recognized her hunger for learning, and that she dreamed of a life where she could breathe clean air and see stars undimmed by factory smoke. What she had not mentioned in her letters was the trunk full of books, worried that he might think her foolish or impractical. Books were heavy, expensive, and to many people, entirely unnecessary for a woman whose duties would revolve around cooking, cleaning, and eventually bearing children. But Rebecca could no more leave her books behind than she could leave her own heart. They had sustained her through her mother's death when she was 16, through the grinding poverty of factory work, through the loneliness of being an educated woman in a world that often punished such things. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the express office, and Rebecca gathered her courage along with her reticule. The driver helped her down, then heaved her trunk onto the dusty street with a grunt of effort. "Heavy load, miss," he observed, wiping his brow. "Hope you did not pack rocks." "Books," Rebecca said simply, and the driver's expression shifted to something between pity and confusion. "Well, good luck to you," he said, tipping his hat before climbing back onto his perch. Rebecca stood on the boardwalk, suddenly aware of the eyes upon her. A woman in a blue calico dress paused in her walking to stare. 2 men outside the saloon stopped their conversation to look her over with undisguised curiosity. A mail-order bride was apparently still enough of a novelty in Guthrie to warrant attention, and Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the oppressive Oklahoma heat. "Miss Hughes." She turned toward the voice and found herself looking up at a man who could only be Xavier Oakley. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with shoulders broadened by physical labor and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years working outdoors. His hair was the color of wheat in summer, slightly too long and curling at his collar. His eyes were a startling blue-green, like creek water in sunlight, and they studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He wore dusty work clothes, clean but clearly well-worn, and a hat he quickly removed as he approached. "Mr. Oakley," Rebecca said, relieved that her voice came out steady. "Yes, I am Rebecca Hughes." Xavier's face broke into a smile that transformed his rather serious features into something genuinely warm. "Welcome to Guthrie, Miss Hughes. I hope your journey was not too difficult." His gaze dropped to the trunk at her feet, and she saw his eyes widen slightly at its size. "That is quite a piece of luggage. I can explain," Rebecca began, then stopped herself. She had promised herself she would not apologize for who she was, not anymore. "It contains my books. I should have mentioned them in my letters, but I was concerned it might seem impractical." Xavier crouched down beside the trunk, testing its weight with one hand. When he looked up at her, his expression was impossible to read. "How many books?" 47, Rebecca admitted, lifting her chin slightly in unconscious defiance. For a long moment, Xavier simply looked at her, and Rebecca felt the future hanging in the balance. He could tell her the books were too much, that she would need to leave them behind. He could mock her for her pretensions. He could reveal himself to be like so many men who believed women should concern themselves solely with domestic matters and leave learning to their betters. Instead, Xavier stood and dusted off his hands. "Well then," he said quietly, "I suppose we had better get them safely to the ranch. The wagon is just around the corner." He hefted the trunk with a grunt of effort, muscles straining beneath his shirt, and started walking. After a few steps, he glanced back at her. "Are you coming, Miss Hughes, or would you prefer to stay in town?" Rebecca hurried after him, her heart suddenly lighter. "I am coming." The wagon was indeed around the corner, a sturdy buckboard hitched to two patient-looking horses. Xavier loaded the trunk with obvious care, making sure it was secure before helping Rebecca up onto the seat. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, Rebecca studied him from the corner of her eye. His hands were large and calloused, his profile strong-featured and honest. There was a quietness about him that she appreciated after the constant noise of Boston. They rode in silence for the first mile, leaving Guthrie behind and heading into the rolling prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. The grass was golden in the late summer heat, broken occasionally by stands of cottonwoods or the dark line of a creek. The sky seemed impossibly vast, a dome of brilliant blue unmarred by the smoke and soot she had known all her life. "It is beautiful," Rebecca said softly. Xavier glanced at her, surprised. "You think so? Most women from back east find it too empty." "I find it spacious," Rebecca corrected. "In Boston, I shared a room with 3 other women in a boarding house. The streets were so crowded you could barely walk. Here, I feel like I can finally breathe." Something in Xavier's expression shifted, became more relaxed. "That is exactly how I felt when I came here 5 years ago. I grew up in Missouri, working my father's farm. When they opened up the Oklahoma Territory for settlement, I joined the land run of 1889 and claimed a quarter section. It has been hard work building it up, but it is mine. Every fence post, every head of cattle, every structure. Mine." He paused, seeming to hear the pride in his own voice. "I do not mean to boast. It is not boasting to take pride in honest work," Rebecca said. "You should be proud. Building something from nothing is no small accomplishment." Xavier smiled at that, a quick flash of pleasure. "What about you, Miss Hughes? Your letters mentioned working in a factory." Rebecca nodded, memories of those long, grueling days making her hands tighten in her lap. "A textile mill. The work was hard and the pay was little, but it kept me from starving after my mother passed. My father died when I was young, and we had no other family. I was fortunate that Father Michael at our parish church taught me to read and write, and he let me borrow books from his personal library. He believed that education was a gift that should be shared with anyone hungry for it, regardless of their station or sex." "He sounds like a good man," Xavier observed. "He was. He died 2 years ago, which is when I truly began to consider leaving Boston. Without him, there was nothing keeping me there except the familiar, and the familiar was not enough." Rebecca looked out at the prairie again, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "Your advertisement mentioned that you wanted honesty, hard work, and respect. Those seemed like reasonable things to ask for, so I answered." "And you mentioned that you wanted a life where you could breathe," Xavier said quietly. "I remember that line from your first letter. It struck me because that is exactly how I felt before I came here, like I was suffocating." They looked at each other then, really looked, and Rebecca felt something shift between them. This was not love, not yet, but it was the recognition of kindred spirits. They were both people who had felt trapped by their circumstances and had possessed the courage to change them. The ranch house appeared as they crested a rise, and Rebecca caught her breath. It was not large, but it was solidly built, a simple wooden structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney. Behind it stood a barn, a chicken coop, and several outbuildings. Cattle dotted the grassland beyond, moving slowly in the heat. It was modest by any standard, but to Rebecca, who had never owned anything more permanent than the clothes on her back, it looked like a kingdom. "It is not much," Xavier said, and she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "It is wonderful," Rebecca said honestly. "Truly, Mr. Oakley, it is more than I dared hope for." Xavier pulled the wagon up in front of the house and set the brake before climbing down. He came around to help Rebecca descend, his hand steadying her by the waist as she stepped down. For a moment they stood very close, and Rebecca could smell the clean scent of him, soap and sunshine and honest sweat. Then he stepped back, cleared his throat, and reached for her trunk. "Let me show you inside," he said. "I cleaned everything this morning, but I am afraid my housekeeping skills are not exactly refined." The interior of the house was indeed simple but clean. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room combined. A pot-bellied stove stood against one wall, a table with 4 chairs in the center, and a rocking chair near the window. 2 doors led off the main room. Xavier gestured to one. "That is my room. That was my room. I moved my things into the back room this morning. The main bedroom should be yours until—" He trailed off, color rising in his cheeks. "Until we are properly married," Rebecca finished for him. "That is considerate of you, Mr. Oakley. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. Please call me Xavier. And I thought we would go into town tomorrow to see Reverend Matthews. He performs weddings on Sundays after service, but given the circumstances, he might be willing to do it sooner. Unless you would prefer to wait." Rebecca shook her head. She had thought about this carefully during the long journey from Boston. "I would prefer not to wait. We have made our commitment through our letters. A ceremony will make it legal and proper, but the choice has already been made, has it not?" Xavier's shoulders relaxed slightly. Yes, it has." He carried her trunk into the bedroom and set it down carefully at the foot of the bed. The room contained a simple brass bedstead with a colorful quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a small dresser with a mirror above it. A window looked out over the prairie, and white curtains stirred in the breeze. "It is perfect," Rebecca said softly. Xavier nodded, looking relieved. "I will let you settle in. I need to check on the cattle before supper. You know how to cook." "I should have asked that in the letters, but it seemed rude somehow." Rebecca smiled. "I know how to cook basic meals. I will not claim to be an expert, but I can keep us from starving." "That is more than I can say for myself," Xavier admitted with a rueful grin. "Most of what I make is either burned or undercooked, sometimes both at once. I will be grateful for anything that is actually edible." After he left, Rebecca opened her trunk with trembling hands. Her books lay carefully wrapped in her few items of clothing, each one protected from damage during the journey. She lifted them out one by one, running her fingers over familiar covers. Shakespeare and Dickens, Austen and Bront, Homer and Virgil in translation. History books and philosophy, poetry and science. Each one represented hours saved from meager wages, careful negotiations with used booksellers, precious gifts from Father Michael. She stacked them carefully on the floor beside the bed, already dreaming of proper shelves where they could rest. But that was a luxury for later. For now, she needed to make supper and begin the process of transforming this house into a home. The kitchen area was better stocked than she had expected. Xavier had flour, salt, bacon, beans, potatoes, and even a few tins of vegetables. She found eggs in a basket on the counter, still warm from the chickens. It was more than enough to work with. Rebecca tied an apron around her waist and set to work, letting the familiar rhythms of cooking soothe her nerves. She was frying bacon when Xavier returned, bringing with him the scent of the outdoors and the sound of his boots on the porch. He paused in the doorway, watching her work, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "It smells wonderful," he said. "It is just bacon and eggs with fried potatoes," Rebecca replied, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing fancy." "It smells like a home," Xavier said quietly. "That is something I have not had in a very long time." They ate at the table as the sun set outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The conversation came easier now, both of them relaxing into each other's company. Xavier told her about his plans for the ranch, his hope to increase his herd and perhaps buy adjacent land. Rebecca told him about Boston, about the books she loved, about her dreams of one day having read all the great works of literature. "Why books?" Xavier asked as she cleared the plates. "I am not criticizing, I am genuinely curious. What is it about them that matters so much to you?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "Books were my escape when life was difficult. They showed me that there were other ways to live, other places to be, other ideas to consider. But more than that, they taught me that my thoughts mattered. That I could have opinions about important things, that my mind was worth cultivating." She turned to face him. "In the world I came from, women were expected to be small and quiet and concerned only with domestic matters. Books taught me that I could be more." Xavier stood and came to stand beside her at the wash basin. "For what it is worth, I am glad you brought them, and I am glad you answered my advertisement. I was not certain anyone would. What kind of woman wants to marry a stranger and move to the middle of nowhere?" "The kind who believes that nowhere can become somewhere with the right person," Rebecca said. They looked at each other in the dimming light, and Xavier slowly reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, questioning. Rebecca held very still, her heart pounding. Then he stepped back. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we will go into town tomorrow and make this official. Then you will be Rebecca Oakley, and this will be your home in truth." "I would like that," Rebecca whispered. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed and listening to the vast silence of the prairie, Rebecca felt hope bloom in her chest for the first time in years. Xavier Oakley was a good man. She was certain of it. Perhaps love would come with time. Perhaps it was already beginning, a small seed planted in the rich soil of mutual respect and growing understanding. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Rebecca dressed in her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Her dark hair she pinned up carefully, allowing a few curls to frame her face. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Xavier waiting in clothes that were clearly his Sunday best, his hair neatly combed and his jaw freshly shaved. "You look beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." The ride into Guthrie seemed to pass in mere moments. Xavier handled the reins with easy competence, and Rebecca found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He caught her looking and grinned, and she felt her blush deepen. Reverend Matthews was a kindly man in his 50s who greeted them warmly at the small church on the edge of town. "Mr. Oakley, this must be your bride," he said, shaking Rebecca's hand. "Welcome to Guthrie, my dear. I must say, I am pleased Xavier finally decided to take a wife. A man needs a helpmate, particularly out here. And a woman needs a partner," Rebecca replied firmly. "I believe we will be well matched." The Reverend's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "Indeed. Well then, shall we proceed with the ceremony? Do you have witnesses?" Xavier had anticipated this, and had arranged for two of his neighbors to attend. George and Martha Preston were in their 40s, with sun-weathered faces and warm smiles. Martha embraced Rebecca immediately. "I am so glad Xavier found someone," she said. "I have been telling him for years that he needed to stop being so stubborn and find himself a wife. That ranch is too much for one person to manage alone." The ceremony itself was simple and brief. Rebecca and Xavier stood before the reverend and spoke their vows in the quiet church, sunlight streaming through the plain glass windows. When Xavier slipped a simple gold band onto Rebecca's finger, his hands were shaking slightly. When the reverend pronounced them man and wife, Xavier kissed her with a gentleness that made her throat tight with emotion. "Welcome to the family," Martha said afterward, hugging Rebecca again. "You must come for supper next week. I want to hear all about Boston, and you should meet some of the other women in the area. We have a small community, but we look after each other." They stopped at the general store before heading back to the ranch. Xavier insisted that Rebecca pick out fabric for new dresses and any supplies she thought they might need. As they were loading their purchases into the wagon, the store owner, a portly man named Henry Walsh, brought out several large pieces of wood. "Almost forgot," he said to Xavier. "You asked me to set these aside for you. Good solid oak, just like you specified." "What are those for?" Rebecca asked as Xavier loaded the planks carefully into the wagon bed. Xavier looked almost embarrassed. "I thought I might build some shelves for your books. They should not stay on the floor." Rebecca felt her eyes sting with sudden tears. "You thought about that?" "Of course I did. Your books are important to you, which makes them important to me." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. On the ride home, Rebecca found herself sliding closer to Xavier on the wagon seat. He glanced at her and smiled, then tentatively put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into his warmth, feeling safe in a way she had not felt since her mother died. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not making me choose between being who I am and having a home. Many men would have." Xavier's arm tightened around her. "Then many men are fools. Rebecca, I asked for a wife because I needed a partner, not a servant. If I wanted someone to simply cook and clean without having thoughts of her own, I would have hired a housekeeper. I wanted someone to share my life with, to build something together with. Your mind, your thoughts, your books, they are all part of who you are. Why would I want to diminish that?" Rebecca tilted her head to look up at him. "How did you become so wise?" "I am not wise. I just know what loneliness feels like, and I know that true companionship requires two whole people, not one person trying to make themselves smaller to fit what the other expects." That night, their first as husband and wife, was gentle and sweet. Xavier was patient and careful, concerned for her comfort above all else. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Rebecca felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she was meant to be. This was who she was meant to be with. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Rebecca learned the routines of the ranch, discovering that she enjoyed the physical work of caring for the chickens, tending the small vegetable garden Xavier had started, even helping with some of the lighter cattle work. Xavier, for his part, proved to be exactly the kind of man his letters had suggested. Honest, hardworking, and unfailingly respectful. In the evenings, after supper was cleared and the dishes washed, they would sit together on the porch and watch the sun set. Sometimes, Xavier would ask Rebecca to read aloud from one of her books. She had been hesitant at first, worried that he might find it boring, but he listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and engaging with the ideas presented. "I never had much education," he admitted one night as she closed a volume of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson. I can read and write and do figures, but that is about it. My family needed me working, not studying. I always wondered what I missed. You can learn anything you want, Rebecca said. Education is not just about formal schooling. It is about curiosity and the willingness to engage with ideas. You have both of those things. Xavier looked at her with such warmth that it took her breath away. You make me want to be better, he said quietly. Smarter, more thoughtful. You make me want to understand the world the way you do. And you make me feel safe enough to be fully myself, Rebecca replied. Do you know how rare that is? He kissed her then, slow and deep, and when they went inside they did not bother lighting the lamp. True to his word, Xavier began building bookshelves. He worked on them in the evenings and on Sunday afternoons, carefully measuring and cutting, sanding the wood smooth, fitting the pieces together with obvious pride. He built them in sections that lined the walls of the main room, creating what began to look like a proper library. As the shelves went up, Rebecca arranged her books lovingly on them, organizing them by subject and author. She stepped back to admire the effect and felt her throat tighten with emotion. These books, which had been her only treasures for so long, now had a home. She had a home. What do you think? Xavier asked, coming to stand beside her. He had sawdust in his hair and a smudge of dirt on his cheek, and Rebecca thought he had never looked more handsome. I think it is perfect, she said, reaching up to wipe the dirt away. I think you are perfect. Xavier caught her hand and brought it to his lips. I am far from perfect, but I am trying to be worthy of you. You already are, Rebecca said firmly. Martha Preston kept her promise, inviting them for supper the following week. The Preston ranch was larger than Xavier's, with a proper ranch house and several hired hands. Over a meal of roasted chicken and fresh vegetables from Martha's garden, Rebecca met several other neighboring families. The women were curious but kind, asking questions about Boston and her journey west. When they learned about Rebecca's books, several of them expressed wistful interest. I have not read a new book in 3 years, said Sarah Montgomery, a young woman near Rebecca's age who lived with her husband on the next ranch over. We have a Bible and a few old dime novels, but that is all. I miss having something new to read. An idea sparked in Rebecca's mind. Would you like to borrow some of mine? I would be happy to lend them to you. Sarah's face lit up. Really? You would do that, of course. Books are meant to be shared. What is the point of having knowledge if you keep it locked away? By the end of the evening, Rebecca had promised to lend books to 4 different women, and Martha had suggested starting a regular gathering where they could discuss what they were reading. A book circle, she said enthusiastically. We could meet once a month, rotate between houses. It would give us something to look forward to. On the ride home, Xavier reached over and squeezed Rebecca's hand. You are going to change things around here, he said. These women have been starved for intellectual stimulation, and they did not even realize it until you arrived. I just want to share what has been given to me, Rebecca said. Father Michael believed that education should not be the province of the wealthy alone. I believe that too. As summer faded into fall, the book circle became a fixture of life in the community surrounding Guthrie. Women who had been isolated on their ranches now had a reason to gather, to talk, to share ideas. They read novels and poetry, history and philosophy. The discussions were lively and often continued long past the official end of the meetings. Xavier, meanwhile, continued to improve the ranch with a focus and dedication that Rebecca found admirable. He consulted her on decisions, valuing her opinion even on matters where she had no experience. When he proposed buying additional cattle in the spring, he laid out his reasoning and asked what she thought. When she suggested he might negotiate for a better price by offering to trade beef for goods with some of the local merchants, He acted on her advice and saved considerable money. "We make a good team," he told her one night as they lay in bed, her head resting on his chest. "I can handle the physical work, but you see angles I miss. You think about things differently. Different perspectives make for better decisions," Rebecca said, tracing idle patterns on his skin. "That is why it is foolish to exclude half the population from important conversations." Xavier chuckled. "You would have made a fine suffragette." "I still might," Rebecca said. "The movement is growing. Women are starting to demand the vote, and rightfully so. If we pay taxes and are expected to follow laws, we should have a say in making those laws." "I agree," Xavier said simply, and Rebecca lifted her head to look at him in surprise. "You do? Why would I not? You are every bit as intelligent as I am, probably more so. You can read and write better. You understand politics and philosophy. You can argue a point with logic and evidence. Why should your opinion on how this country is run matter less than mine simply because you are a woman?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "If women had the vote, maybe we would elect better leaders. The men certainly have not been doing a stellar job." Rebecca kissed him fiercely. "I love you," she said, and then froze, realizing it was the first time either of them had spoken those words aloud. Xavier's eyes widened, then softened. "I love you too," he said quietly. "I think I have loved you since I saw you standing on that boardwalk, determined not to apologize for who you are. You have brought so much light into my life, Rebecca. I cannot imagine going back to how things were before." "Then it is a good thing you will never have to," Rebecca said, and kissed him again. The first snow came in late November, dusting the prairie with white and bringing with it a cold that bit deep. Xavier ensured they had plenty of firewood stacked against the house, and Rebecca spent hours preserving vegetables and meat for the winter months. The book circle continued despite the weather, with women braving the cold to gather and discuss their latest reading. One afternoon in early December, as Rebecca was preparing supper and Xavier was in the barn tending to the horses, she heard the sound of approaching hooves. She looked out the window to see a wagon pulling up, driven by Henry Walsh from the general store. Beside him sat another man, younger and better dressed, carrying what looked like several large parcels. Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch. Xavier emerged from the barn at the same time, his expression curious but welcoming. "Mr. Walsh," he called. "What brings you out here in this cold?" Henry climbed down from the wagon with a broad smile. "Got a delivery for you, Xavier, or rather for your wife. This here is Thomas Crawford. He has come all the way from Kansas City." The younger man tipped his hat to Rebecca. "Mrs. Oakley, I hope I am not intruding. I am a book salesman, and Mr. Walsh told me about your collection. I was hoping you might be interested in seeing some of our latest offerings." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You sell books?" "Indeed I do, madam. I represent Crawford and Sons Publishers, and we carry everything from the latest novels to scientific texts, history books to poetry collections." He began unloading parcels from the wagon. "Mr. Walsh mentioned that you have started something of a lending library here, and I thought you might appreciate the opportunity to expand your collection." Rebecca looked at Xavier, who was watching her with an expression of barely suppressed amusement. "Did you arrange this?" she asked. "I may have mentioned to Henry that you might be interested in acquiring more books," Xavier admitted. "And he may have known that Mr. Crawford makes a circuit through the territories twice a year." Thomas Crawford spread his wares out on the porch, unwrapping parcels to reveal pristine books with unbent spines and crisp pages. Rebecca knelt beside them, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up volume after volume. New novels by popular authors, scientific treatises, books of poetry, histories of ancient civilizations. It was a treasure trove beyond her wildest dreams. "How much?" she asked, already calculating what they could afford from the household funds. Xavier crouched beside her. "The money from selling those cattle last month, remember? I said we would decide together how to spend the extra. I cannot think of a better use than this." "But the ranch," Rebecca protested. "There are things you need." "The ranch is doing fine. And this is for the ranch too, in a way. You are sharing these books with the whole community. That makes them an investment in all of us." He looked at Thomas Crawford. "How much for the lot?" They negotiated a fair price, and by the time Thomas Crawford and Henry Walsh departed an hour later, Rebecca was the proud owner of 32 new books. She stacked them on the floor of the main room, still in disbelief at her good fortune. "I cannot believe you did this," she said, turning to Xavier with tears in her eyes. "Why not? Your happiness is my happiness. Seeing your face light up like that is worth more than any amount of money." He pulled her into his arms. "Besides, I have selfish reasons too. Now you will have new things to read to me in the evenings." Rebecca laughed through her tears. "I love you so much." "I love you too. Now, tell me which one we should start with tonight." Christmas that year was a simple but joyful affair. Rebecca and Xavier exchanged modest gifts. She gave him a warm scarf she had knitted from wool purchased in town, and he gave her a beautiful writing desk he had built himself, complete with small drawers for paper and ink and a smooth surface perfect for writing. They spent Christmas Day with the Prestons and several other neighboring families, sharing a feast and singing carols around the piano in the Prestons' parlor. As winter deepened and then began to give way to early spring, Rebecca realized with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that her monthly courses had not come for 2 months running. She said nothing at first, wanting to be certain, but when the 3rd month passed and she began to experience waves of nausea in the mornings, she knew she could no longer deny the truth. She told Xavier one evening after supper, her heart pounding with uncertainty. She had no idea how he would react to the news. They had never explicitly discussed children, and she worried that he might feel it was too soon, or that the added responsibility would strain their still new marriage. "Xavier, I need to tell you something," she said, setting down the dish towel with trembling hands. He looked up from the harness he was mending, instantly attentive to the tension in her voice. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong exactly. At least, I do not think it is wrong." "I hope it is not wrong." She took a breath. "I am with child." For a moment, Xavier simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he carefully set down the harness, stood, and crossed the room in 3 long strides. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around as a broad smile broke across his face. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." Rebecca laughed with relief, clinging to his shoulders. "You are happy." "Happy." "Rebecca, I am beyond happy. I am overjoyed. You have given me a home, a purpose, love, and now a child. How could I be anything but happy?" He set her down gently, then immediately looked worried. "Should I have done that? Did I hurt you? Should you be sitting down?" "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Rebecca said, but she was smiling. "The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday when I went with Martha. I am healthy, the baby is healthy, and everything should progress normally." Xavier placed his hand on her stomach, which was still flat but would soon begin to swell. "A son or daughter," he marveled, "part of you and part of me." "Are you hoping for one or the other?" Rebecca asked. Xavier shook his head. "I just want a healthy child and a safe delivery for you." "Boy or girl, it does not matter. Either way, we will teach them to read and think and question the world around them, and they will grow up knowing they are loved beyond measure." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and into summer. Rebecca continued her usual activities as long as she felt able, only gradually slowing down as her belly swelled and movement became more awkward. The women of the book circle rallied around her, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and offering to help however they could. Xavier became absurdly protective, constantly worrying that Rebecca was doing too much or not resting enough. She found it endearing even as she gently reminded him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly capable of knowing her own limits. In late August, as the prairie grass turned gold again and the anniversary of Rebecca's arrival in Oklahoma approached, she went into labor. Martha Preston arrived to help, along with the midwife from Guthrie, a capable woman named Ellen Moore who had delivered half the babies in the county. Xavier paced anxiously on the porch, barred from the bedroom by Martha's firm insistence that this was women's work and he would only be in the way. He could hear Rebecca's cries of pain through the window, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He had faced down angry cattle and dangerous storms without flinching, but the sound of his wife in pain reduced him to a nervous wreck. Finally, after hours that felt like years, he heard a new sound, the thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. He froze, hardly daring to breathe. A moment later, Martha emerged onto the porch with a broad smile. "Congratulations, Xavier, you have a son. And Rebecca is doing fine, just tired. Come meet your boy." Xavier entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Rebecca lay propped up on pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale but radiant. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a blanket, and when Xavier approached, she pulled the fabric back to reveal a tiny red face with a shock of dark hair. "Meet Daniel Xavier Oakley," she said softly. "Our son." Xavier reached out with one finger to touch the baby's impossibly small hand, and when tiny fingers reflexively curled around his, he felt his eyes fill with tears. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you for this." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Rebecca leaned into him, both of them gazing down at their son in wonder. Outside, the Oklahoma sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, and the future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. The months that followed were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Daniel was a good baby, healthy and relatively content, but the demands of caring for an infant while also maintaining the ranch kept both Rebecca and Xavier constantly busy. They worked together seamlessly, Xavier taking his turn walking the floor with a fussy baby at night, Rebecca helping with ranch work whenever she could steal a moment. The book circle continued, though Rebecca had to miss a few meetings in those early months. The women were understanding, and several of them took turns coming to visit her instead, bringing food and offering to watch Daniel so Rebecca could nap or have a moment to herself. As Daniel grew from an infant into a baby who could sit up and then crawl, Xavier completed his work on the library. The shelves now covered 2 full walls of the main room, and Rebecca's collection had grown to over 100 volumes through gifts, purchases, and trades with other book lovers she had connected with through correspondence. People from all over the area came to borrow books, and the little ranch house became known as an informal lending library. One evening, when Daniel was almost a year old and toddling around the house with determined if unsteady steps, Xavier and Rebecca sat on the porch watching the sunset. Daniel was inside, finally asleep after a particularly energetic day. Rebecca leaned against Xavier's shoulder, feeling the bone-deep contentment of a life well lived. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked suddenly. "Leaving Boston, taking a chance on a stranger, giving up the possibility of a more sophisticated life." Rebecca turned to look at him in surprise. "Regret it? Xavier, This is the best decision I have ever made. I have a home, a family, work that matters, and the freedom to be fully myself. What more could I possibly want? I just worry sometimes that you might feel isolated out here. You are so intelligent, so educated. In a city, you could have attended lectures, visited museums, been part of intellectual circles. And I would have been patronized and dismissed, and told that women should not concern themselves with such things, Rebecca countered. Here, I can read what I want, think what I want, and share ideas with people who actually listen to me. The women in our book circle are just as hungry for knowledge and discussion as any group of scholars in Boston, and they do not waste time telling me I am being unladylike for having opinions. She took his hand. Besides, none of those things matter as much as being with you. Love is not something you can find in a library or a lecture hall. It is rare and precious, and I am not foolish enough to take it for granted. Xavier pulled her closer. You know, when I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, I was just hoping for someone competent and reasonably pleasant. I never dreamed I would find someone like you. Someone who challenges me and inspires me and makes me want to be better. The feeling is entirely mutual, Rebecca said. Now stop worrying and kiss me. He did, slow and sweet in the fading light. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and small joys. Daniel grew into a bright, curious child who loved books as much as his mother did. Xavier taught him to ride and work with cattle, while Rebecca taught him to read and write and think critically about the world around him. When Daniel was 3, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline, and 2 years after that, another son they called Matthew. The ranch prospered under Xavier's careful management and Rebecca's sharp business sense. They bought additional land, increased their herd, and became one of the most successful operations in the area. But more important than the financial success was the life they had built together, rich in love, learning, and shared purpose. The library continued to grow, funded by the ranch's profits and Rebecca's careful budgeting. What had started as a few shelves to hold her personal collection gradually expanded into a dedicated room, added onto the house when Matthew was born. People came from 20 miles away to borrow books, and Rebecca began teaching reading classes for both children and adults who had never learned. One Sunday afternoon, when Daniel was 7, Caroline 4, and Matthew 2, the family received an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed man in his 50s arrived in a fine buggy, introducing himself as James Harrison, an official from the Territorial Library Commission. "Mrs. Oakley," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "I've heard remarkable things about what you have accomplished here. A functioning lending library in a rural area, reading classes, a book circle that has inspired similar groups throughout the territory. I have come to ask if you might be interested in making this an official branch of the territorial library system. We would provide funding for new books and materials, and in return, you would agree to keep regular hours and maintain records of your lending." Rebecca looked at Xavier, who was grinning broadly. "I think that sounds like an excellent idea, Mr. Harrison. Do you not agree, Rebecca?" "I think it sounds almost too good to be true," Rebecca admitted. "But yes, I would be honored to participate in such a program." The contract was signed, and the Oakley Ranch Library became an official institution. With the territorial funding, Rebecca was able to purchase books at a scale she had never imagined possible. The collection grew to include texts on agriculture, medicine, law, and dozens of other practical subjects alongside literature and philosophy. Farmers came seeking information on new techniques, mothers researched childhood illnesses. Young people discovered worlds beyond the prairie through novels and travel narratives. Xavier built additional shelves, then an annex to the library room. He constructed proper reading tables and comfortable chairs. What had begun as a simple gift of bookshelves for his wife's treasured collection had transformed into something that served the entire community. As Oklahoma moved toward statehood in 1907, the Oakley family traveled to Guthrie to witness the historic occasion. They stood in the crowd with their 3 children, now 12, 9, and 7, watching as Oklahoma officially became the 46th state in the Union. Rebecca squeezed Xavier's hand, thinking about how much had changed in the 14 years since she had arrived on that stagecoach, nervous and uncertain but hopeful. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, reading the reflective expression on her face. "I am thinking about how one decision can change everything," Rebecca said. "If I had not answered your advertisement, if you had not accepted my trunk full of books, if we had not chosen to build this life together, none of this would exist. Not the library, not our children, not the community we have helped create." "You know what I think about," Xavier said. "I think about how you looked that first day, standing on the boardwalk with your chin up, ready to defend your books if necessary. I fell a little bit in love with you right then, even though I did not realize it yet. You were brave and determined and utterly yourself, and I knew that my life was about to change for the better." Their oldest son, Daniel, tugged on Rebecca's sleeve. "Mother, when we get home, can we read more of that history book? The one about ancient Rome? I want to know what happens after Caesar crosses the Rubicon." Caroline piped up from Xavier's arms. "And can we read my fairy tale book too? I want to hear about the princess who saved herself." "We can read both," Rebecca promised, smoothing Daniel's hair and smiling at Caroline. "We have plenty of time for all the books you want." "That is because we have the best library in the whole state," Matthew announced proudly. "Teacher said so." Xavier and Rebecca exchanged amused glances over their children's heads. "She may be slightly biased," Xavier said, "but I would not argue with the sentiment." That evening, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Xavier and Rebecca sat in the library that had grown from his simple gift. Books lined every wall, their spines creating a patchwork of colors and textures. The room smelled of paper and leather and old glue, a scent that Rebecca had loved since childhood. "Thank you," Rebecca said softly. Xavier looked over at her from his chair. "For what? I have not done anything today except watch speeches and wrangle over excited children. For building this. For understanding why it mattered. For never making me feel like I had to choose between being a wife and mother and being an educated woman with interests beyond the domestic sphere." She gestured at the walls of books. "Most men would have told me to get rid of these, that they were taking up space and serving no practical purpose. You built me a library." "Well, I could hardly let them stay on the floor," Xavier said with a smile. Then his expression grew more serious. "Rebecca, you gave up everything you knew to come here and marry a stranger. The least I could do was make sure you had the things that mattered to you. Besides, look at what it has become. This library has touched hundreds of lives. Children are learning to read. Adults are finding information they need. People are discovering that their minds and their questions matter. All because you had the courage to bring 47 books in a trunk, and I had enough sense to appreciate what that meant." "We built it together," Rebecca corrected. "Everything we have, we built together." Xavier stood and offered her his hand. "Come to bed, my love. Tomorrow we will have a house full of children and likely several people wanting to borrow books. We should rest while we can." The years continued to roll past, bringing their share of joys and challenges. There was the year of the terrible drought, when Xavier and Rebecca worked side by side to keep the cattle alive and the ranch functioning. There was the year Caroline fell from a horse and broke her arm, sending Rebecca into a panic, until the doctor assured them she would be fine. There was the year Matthew decided he wanted to be a lawyer and began reading every legal text in the library with single-minded determination. Through it all, the library remained the heart of their home and their community. Daniel eventually went off to college, the first Oakley to do so, with dreams of becoming a teacher. Caroline discovered a passion for botany and began cataloging every plant species on the ranch. Matthew did indeed pursue law, reading for the bar and eventually establishing a practice in Guthrie that focused on helping small farmers and ranchers navigate legal challenges. Xavier and Rebecca aged together, their hair graying and their faces acquiring the lines that come from years of laughter, hard work, and deep love. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Xavier presented Rebecca with a leather-bound journal. "For writing down our story," he said. "So our grandchildren will know how their grandmother arrived with a trunk full of books and changed everything." Rebecca opened the journal, running her fingers over the cream-colored pages. "What should I title it?" "How about The Library That Love Built?" Xavier suggested. "Because that is what this is it not? The library was my way of showing you that I loved you for exactly who you were, and everything that grew from it, all the lives it has touched, all the minds it has opened, that is the legacy of that love." Rebecca began to write that evening, sitting at the desk Xavier had built her so many years ago. She wrote about Boston and Father Michael, about the decision to answer an advertisement from a stranger in Oklahoma Territory. She wrote about arriving in Guthrie with her trunk full of books, about Xavier's quiet acceptance, about the first tentative shelves that had grown into a full library. She wrote about their children and their life together, about the community they had helped build, and the people who had come to see books not as luxuries but as necessities. She wrote about love, the kind that saw another person fully and cherished them completely. When she finished, weeks later she showed Xavier the completed manuscript. He read it carefully, his eyes growing damp in places. "This is our truth," he said finally. "This is who we are and what we have built. It is a good story, Rebecca." "It is our story," she corrected. "And it is not over yet." She was right. There were still years ahead of them, rich with the joys of grandchildren and the satisfaction of watching their children build their own lives. The library continued to grow and serve, even as the world around it changed. Cars replaced wagons, electricity came to the ranch, and the frontier feeling of the Oklahoma Territory gave way to settled civilization. But through all those changes, the core remained the same. Books that opened minds, love that sustained hearts, and the legacy of two people who had taken a chance on each other and built something beautiful. One evening, when Rebecca was in her late 60s and Xavier in his early 70s, they sat on their porch watching yet another Oklahoma sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Their children were grown and successful, their grandchildren numerous and delightful, their library a thriving institution that had recently received a generous endowment from the state. "You remember that first night?" Rebecca asked, her hand clasped in Xavier's. "When you told me this would be my home?" "I remember everything about our early days together," Xavier replied. "I was so nervous you would be disappointed. The house was so small, the ranch so rough, and I had no idea if I could give you the kind of life you deserved." "You gave me everything that mattered," Rebecca said firmly. "You gave me respect, partnership, love, and the freedom to be fully myself. You took a lonely woman's trunk full of books and built a library. You took a mail-order bride and made her a cherished wife. You took a chance and built a family. Those are the things that matter, Xavier. Not wealth or sophistication or any of the superficial measures the world uses. Just love and respect and the courage to build something together. Xavier lifted her hand to his lips. You are my greatest adventure, Rebecca Oakley. Greater than claiming land in the land run, greater than building this ranch, greater than anything else I have ever done. Loving you and being loved by you is the accomplishment I am most proud of. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, one by one, in the darkening sky. From inside the house came the sounds of their daughter Caroline and her children, visiting for the week. Laughter and chatter, the normal chaos of family life. We built a good life, Rebecca said softly. We built a great life, Xavier corrected. And it all started with you being brave enough to bring your books and me being smart enough to build you shelves. Everything else grew from that single act of mutual respect and understanding. Many years later, when both Xavier and Rebecca had passed on to their rest and were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, the library they had built together continued to stand. It had been expanded multiple times over the decades, eventually becoming a proper public library that served not just the local community but the entire region. Above the entrance, a bronze plaque told the story in simple words. The Oakley Memorial Library. Founded by Rebecca and Xavier Oakley, who believed that books could change lives and that love could build anything. Established 1893. Inside, visitors could still see some of the original shelves Xavier had built, carefully preserved even as the building modernized around them. The collection had grown to thousands of volumes, but displayed in a place of honor behind glass were 47 books, the ones Rebecca had brought with her in a trunk all those years ago. Generations of children learned to read within those walls. Young people discovered possibilities beyond their immediate horizons. Adults found the information and inspiration they needed to build better lives. And everyone who entered learned the story of a mail-order bride who brought books and a cowboy who built her a library, and the great love that flourished between them. It was a story that deserved to be remembered, a testament to what was possible when two people chose to see and value each other fully. It was a story of courage and kindness, of intellectual hunger and emotional generosity, of the transformative power of both books and love. But more than anything, it was a story that proved what Xavier and Rebecca had discovered on that first evening when he began building shelves for her books. That the greatest adventures begin not with grand gestures but with small acts of understanding, that the deepest love grows from mutual respect, and that the most lasting legacies are built not of stone or gold but of courage, compassion, and the simple willingness to honor another person's dreams as fully as your own. In the end, that was the true story of the mail-order bride who came with a trunk full of books and the cowboy who built her a library. Not just a story of books or buildings, but a story of two souls who found each other across the distance and built a love that lasted generations, touching countless lives and proving that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is simply the space to be fully, completely, unapologetically themselves. And from that space, from that gift of acceptance and love, anything becomes possible. Even a library that changes the world, one book and one life at a time.